Hi, Bother Brigade. Here's what's bothering me today. Yay, we're back on camera. I'm still feeling really under the weather, but at least I'm not having to wrap myself in several more layers of clothes and under blankets and stuff. So, progress, I guess. And on that note of progress, let's talk a little bit more about what's happening in Ukraine and with Russia and everything. So, as of recording, which is about 5:45 in the evening, I saw the news that, a couple things, right? Earlier in the day, I had seen that Zelensky had signed an agreement to actually request that Ukraine be allowed into the European Union. So it's not NATO, but it's definitely, again, one of the big red lines that Russia doesn't want crossed. So let's talk a little bit about that and also some of the other stuff we've been seeing online, such as suggestions of using thermobaric weaponry. For those unaware, thermobaric weaponry is basically a step below what's considered a weapon of mass destruction. Russia's previously used them to terrifying effect against insurgencies in Chechnya and Ingushetia, and they're considering deploying them to Ukraine. As some people probably saw by now, this is one of the things that I saw recently, is there have been several reports out of Kharkiv, another large city close to the border with Russia, of dozens dead and hundreds more wounded as the attacks have been ramped up. So it looks like the Russians have adjusted and they are responding more forcefully now, which unfortunately means more innocent people are going to die. But let's talk about what all this means put together for Putin and Russia and Ukraine and the West, because Putin did something that genuinely surprised me. I thought that the next step, when he said consequences the likes you've never seen before, would have been shutting off the gas taps that he owns, and also basically as punishment for them canceling the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Instead, he went straight for the nuclear threat. So this shows a couple things. Again, disclaimer here, as I've said before, I'm not a foreign policy expert by any stretch of the imagination. But what Putin did by escalating the threat, that definitely surprised me. So let's get to thinking on why he did this. Putin, generally speaking, is a smart man. However, it's possible that various people have been lying to him. He himself overestimated his power and influence. And there have been some other developments that have happened recently. So Kazakhstan said no to the request for additional Russian troops. However, Belarus apparently said that they might declare a war if they haven't already. So this is terrifying, and it looks like things are spilling into even more of a quagmire in the East. So what does this mean for both Ukraine and Russia moving forward? As I've talked about, and what I said in the previous video, just outlining Russia's geostrategic interests, that still remains. So Russia wants to, install a puppet regime and have them permanently ensure that they're a buffer state and probably give further land concessions and recognize the separatist regions in the Donbass. Now, obviously that's not going to be acceptable to the people of Ukraine, and it's part of why we're seeing, and please keep in mind, people, none of us are immune to propaganda. We're seeing it on both ends right now. But what this generally means, and I hate to say this, I think this is finally the play that the West makes to try and break Russia as a global power. Russia, as I've mentioned before, has historically been a great power in some form or another. So the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, which, sure, technically they were all equal, but it was very much Russia dominating and running the majority of the joint there, let's be real. And so what that resulted in was Russia, especially with the lack of full Western integration, even though historically how Russia became the Russian Empire was by Westernizing. By all rights, Russia should have been added into the fold of the West. So this raises the question, why not? That's a massive historic subject for another time. But what this generally means is that as a result, they've seen themselves as kind of doing their own thing. Russia is Russia, in other words. They don't want to play second fiddle to the United States. They don't want to play second fiddle to China, even though they've had like some, arrangements and relations with them to try and improve security deals and stuff like that. But Russia has always been at odds with the main powers of the world for the past couple centuries. For those unaware, they were very much involved with the British in what was known as the Great Game in Britain, alternatively known as the Tournament of Shadows, which is a way more badass name, by the way, in the Russian Empire. It was a fight over influence and control in Central Asia, which, as you can tell by the Russian Empire and, of course, the subsequent Soviet Union, the Russians won that. Now, Russia also doesn't want to play second fiddle to China, which is the new ascending power, which is why they've tried to be more cooperative, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that enemy being America, which is the great enemy that replaced Britain and all their friends, right? If it wasn't Britain, it was some other Western or Central European powers like the Prussians or then the Germans or the French. So, things have happened in the past. And so Russia's always been at odds with the main global power. And in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and what happened with the establishing of the capitalist oligarch kleptocracy that became Russia after 1991, that meant that these are people now kind of in control of their own little special capitalist cabal with their own relative spheres of influence, and also like a desire for more influence in Europe, which is why places like, as we've touched on before, Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, or just the Caucasian region in general in that area, and Central Asia, especially Eastern Central Asia with all the mountains, are strategically crucial for Russia to maintain control over in some way. This doesn't sit well with the West, and it seems like also maybe China's getting involved by not dealing with a lot more Russian banks and businesses. So I think that unfortunately what we're seeing behind the scenes here is lots of people making a play, especially like in the West, to finally try and break the perennial thorn in the side that is Russia. It's been a thorn in the side since it became the Russian Empire. It's been a thorn in the side since it was the Soviet Union. It's been a thorn in its side since it's been the Federated Republic of Russia, whatever its official name is. And this should concern all of us. And now, I'm thinking that's probably why Putin decided to really up the threat level very quickly. Because for him and the Russian intelligentsia and such, this is a fight for their survival as their own kind of pole in a world, right? And that's concerning because as we've seen how Russia behaves in the past, they are prepared to do just about everything and anything to ensure that they win. What's happening in Ukraine right now is crossing, not saying that it's correct, as I've said before on this channel, Russia feeling entitled to other countries, like you're just going to be a part of our sphere of influence. You just have to accept that. That is very terrible. But let's talk then a little bit about the failure of the West to fully integrate Russia into the West, which would have solved a lot more of these problems. But unfortunately, what's happening right now, and with the removal of Russia from SWIFT, the really strong push to have Ukraine get into NATO and, well, mostly the EU right now, but also NATO, this is the play to fundamentally break what power, like geopolitical power, Russia has, to make it far more about West versus East, because the Russians would be a wild card in terms of the pivot to Asia that lots of American generals and people have been warning about for decades as China becomes the new big bad in the world. Because we always need bad guys to justify massive military budgets and spending while people suffer and die on a dying planet while capitalists get richer and richer. And at the end of the day, that's what this is about, unfortunately. It's about capital and money and access to markets. We're now seeing the capitalist class, like as a collective, begin to turn on each other as, oh look, we've already got all the markets, but now it's now a gang war for territory that are all the different countries around the world. And so I think, unfortunately, that's why Russia has done what it's done, as opposed to turning off the gas pipes, which to me would have been the next, air quotes, logical move for them to make. And so again, why this should concern us is that Russia's prepared to do just about anything for its survival, especially the survival of those at the very top. Which means I'm now inclined to believe that when Putin says he's considering a nuclear option, there's definitely a point where he does decide to use that. What that red line is, I don't know. I don't think a lot of people know. But unfortunately, the West, through Ukraine, is pushing us closer and closer to this showdown with the Russian state and its kleptocracy, which, as we've seen before, rarely turns out well for either side, and usually somehow Russia comes out of it. It may not always be the victor, it may not always be strong, but it usually in some way survives. But I think that what's happening and why the Russians are responding so aggressively in terms of their posturing is that this is finally, and we've seen it with the SWIFT banking and stuff, this is finally the West making a play to break Russia as a global power and influence. And that should concern a lot of people. And I think in some ways it's also maybe trying to send a message to China in terms of, hey, we will mess with another nuclear power who's not on our side. And I think this is just really needless to up the ante for a potential nuclear conflict, while millions of people around the world continue to suffer in Russia, in Ukraine, in America, in China, in Canada, in Kazakhstan, in Britain, everywhere. There is just a monumental amount of suffering. And yet we have the resources to get all of this under control, whether it's the pandemic, which is still ongoing, by the way, or if it's addressing climate change. We have the technical know-how. We have the logistics. We theoretically have the money if you just kind of seize it and or tax it from the capitalist class. We have all the tools and resources at our disposal to fundamentally solve all the problems that ail mankind, from illness to starvation, to housing, to climate change, to the pandemic. We have the capacity, but what we lack is the leadership, because those at the top are concerned with weird geopolitical struggles. It's a petty buyers club of the wealthy using those casual bystanders in the working class, your average civilian, your average Joe and Jane. They're using them as pawns for their own schemes, because unfortunately, to break everyone's conspiracy bubble, most conspiracies aren't that deep once you wake up and realize that the world is run by rich, greedy sociopaths trying to deal with and interact with other rich, greedy sociopaths. That breaks down just about every terrible thing that has happened in the history of humanity. It is so simple and unfortunate, and we've had millennia to fix this. And while the world continues to stare grimly into a bleak goddamn future, we are doing this to each other. We are doing the incomprehensible and risking nuclear annihilation. For what? for money, for power, for influence, for fear of losing influence and power and looking bad in the eyes of your fellow sociopaths and nationalists and bigots and racists. And it's all a sick, disgusting fucking joke, and they're willing to destroy the world for it. And that is what's bothering me today.